Hi guys, I hope you're doing really well. My name is Sarah and welcome to What the Horror, the channel where we talk about horror movies, old and new. It's safe to say that the slasher genre has seen a rather dramatic evolution since it first emerged, perhaps most notably in Halloween-themed slashers. Because of their smaller numbers and the decades between their releases, they give the audience a clearer view of the evolution. John Carpenter's Halloween is often credited with birthing the modern slasher, introducing Michael Myers as a terrifying faceless shape who brought violence to the safety of suburban streets. What made Halloween so impactful was its minimalist approach. Rather than relying on excessive gore, the film instead created suspense and atmosphere, using shadows, score, and the looming presence of Myers to instill fear. The horror was more psychological, with a lot of the tension coming from the sense that something evil was always lurking just out of sight. This subtle, restrained approach resonated with audiences, leaving a lasting mark on the genre and a trail of dedicated fans. Fast forward to today and the landscape looks dramatically different. Films like Terrifier showcase how the slasher genre has embraced a much more graphic and relentless form of horror. Where Michael Myers was an emotionless, controlled killer, Art the Clown revels in explicit violence and grotesque imagery, delivering kills designed to shock and disturb on a visceral level and taking immense pleasure in them. This evolution reflects a shift in audience expectations, with a lot of modern audiences becoming increasingly desensitized to violence. As the slasher genre has progressed, it has often felt the need to escalate how brutal and shocking its violence is, to remain impactful and reflect in modern culture. This has raised an ongoing debate within horror. Does escalating gore and violence make the genre more effective? Is it needed, or is it simply playing for shock value? To look at how the Halloween slasher has evolved over the decades, we'll be focusing on Halloween from 1978 and Terrifier, taking a closer look at the films, the villains, and what they represent in terms of cultural fears. Halloween is widely regarded as a pivotal film in the slasher genre. As I mentioned before, it is often considered the first modern slasher as we know them, and provided and shaped many of the iconic tropes that would define horror for years to come. Directed and co-written by John Carpenter, the film was produced on a modest budget of around $300,000, yet its masterful use of tension, atmosphere, and subtle visual storytelling made it a horror classic. Set in the quiet suburban town of Haddonfield, Halloween follows Michael Myers, who, as a 6-year-old boy, murders his older sister on Halloween night. 15 years later, he escapes from Smith's Grove Sanitarium and returns to Haddonfield, where he embarks on a new killing spree, stalking teenage babysitters while being pursued by his psychiatrist, one Dr. Loomis. Restricted by their small budget, John Carpenter and the crew were forced to create a minimalist style, using the score and clever camera angles to create eerie tension, proving that horror, or fear, doesn't need elaborate or excessive violence. Instead, it relied on anticipation and dread, making the scares in Halloween feel eerily close to home. Halloween built terror from the ordinary, turning the familiar streets and homes of suburbia into places where danger lurked in every shadow. One of Halloween's greatest strengths was its focus on psychological horror and its patience. John Carpenter created a sense of ever-present danger, introducing Michael Myers as a silent stalker who takes his time rather than a killer who strikes immediately. The film follows him as he quietly but determinedly observes his victims, picking them out, and then following them, watching from a distance until the tension builds to the point that he finally attacks. This slow build-up allows audiences' anxiety to grow, because we see the danger, we watch it get closer and closer, while the characters remain innocently unaware of what is coming. There's an overwhelming sense of being watched throughout. This focus on atmosphere, timing, and suspense made the film more unsettling than those relying solely on shock value. Carpenter's use of shadows and off-screen space created a suffocating feeling, leaving a lot to the imagination of the audience, allowing tension to build and sit before delivering those key moments. But there are long stretches in the film where nothing happens in terms of the horror. It relies on its audience being patient. When the violence does come, it's effective without being gratuitous. The kills in Halloween are brutal in terms of intent, but they are incredibly restrained compared to the graphic gore that would define later slashers. Carpenter kept the blood to a minimum, instead preferring to focus on the terror of the stalking, the invasion of the safety of suburbia, and the inevitability of death rather than the death itself. While the kills are important in Halloween, often being used later by Michael in a staging intended to scare other victims, the film seems less concerned with the death than the lead up to the death. But Michael's murders are cold, methodical, and seemingly random, which does add to the unpredictability of his character and to the horror of the film. The lack of outlandish gore helped maintain the film's suspense and allows the film, to this day, to be accessible to a much wider audience. Halloween, like a lot of horror, reflected and tapped into the cultural anxieties of the late 1970s, particularly fears surrounding suburban safety. In the wake of rising crime rates and the news being awash with serial killers, stalking and killing innocent people on the streets and in their homes, there was a growing fear that the idyllic suburban lifestyle wasn't as secure as it once seemed. So playing on the idea that danger could strike without warning in your own backyard resonated with audiences. Michael Myers became the ultimate symbol of this fear, an unstoppable force that invades a small, peaceful community and shatters the illusion of safety. Halloween captured the anxiety of a generation, reflecting fears of random acts of violence, the breakdown of traditional societal structures, and the loss of innocence in the wake of all that. Halloween's horror comes from what you don't see rather than what you do. Rather than relying on overt violence or gore, Carpenter uses a controlled build-up of tension and the relentless approach of Michael Myers. The fear can be found in the film's familiar setting of a suburban street, the vulnerability of everyday life, and the randomness of evil. Terrifier is often seen as a modern embodiment of the slasher genre's evolution, offering an unapologetically brutal take on the genre. Directed, written, and produced by Damien Leone, the film, like Halloween, was made on a very low budget, yet its raw, visceral horror and extreme violence have made it a cult classic among many horror fans. The film's reliance on explicit brutality, combined with its memorable and menacing antagonist, pushes the boundaries of the slasher film. Set on Halloween night, Terrifier follows Art the Clown, a sadistic and silent killer who tortures and kills his victims in grotesque and imaginative ways. The story centers around two young women, Tara and Dawn, who encounter Art after a night of partying, only to be subjected to his relentless and horrifying pursuit. As Art stalks his victims, the film escalates into a showcase of unrelenting graphic violence that is often hard to stomach, even for the gorehounds. In the early years of the slasher genre, the violence was often shocking but relatively restrained, so films like Halloween relied more on suspense and atmosphere rather than explicit gore, focusing on the terror of being hunted by an unseen killer. However, as the genre progressed into the 1980s, franchises like Friday the 13th and A Nightmare on Elm Street embraced a more graphic approach. With the rise of home video and relaxed censorship in the early 80s, filmmakers had the freedom to experiment and push boundaries. Audiences were then drawn to increasingly creative and violent kills, with directors using gore to elevate the horror experience. Jason Voorhees and Freddy Krueger became icons not just for their personas, but because of the inventive, often gruesome ways that they killed their victims. By the late 1990s, with films like Scream, violence and gore had become much more of an essential aspect of the slasher formula. Fast forward to Terrifier, and the genre has had an extreme shift away from the type of horror found in John Carpenter's Halloween. Terrifier represents a new era of slashers, one defined by no-holds-barred brutality and shocking explicit violence. To create the horror in Terrifier, Damien Leone removed the safety nets of typical horror structure. In many slashers, we know the formula. You can often predict when a scare or a kill will happen, but Terrifier throws that predictability out of the window. There are no real clear rules in Terrifier. Characters who seem like potential survivors are killed off at random times, and the violence doesn't build to a crescendo at the end. Instead, it happens with varying levels of extreme violence at varying times. This unpredictability in the formula and narrative helps keep the audience on edge because there's no clear path to survival for the characters, and no comfort in settling into a rhythm of expectation for the audience. This lack of structure can make the film feel more dangerous and a much more unnerving watch. The scares in Terrifier come from the film's nihilistic tone and feeling of chaos. There is no psychological horror, deep exploration of the characters, or meaning behind the violence. This nihilism creates a terrifying world where evil and danger isn't part of a larger narrative. Instead, it's there, art is there, to simply cause suffering. This feeling of a lack of connection to a larger narrative or a larger world is added to by the film's setting of the decrepit, abandoned building that most of the action takes place in. The atmosphere created by the setting is oppressive and at times almost claustrophobic. The retro look of the film with a high contrast and dark rich colours adds a dirty and bleak atmosphere. While Terrifier, as Halloween did in 1978, is still using its setting to create some of its horror, it's no longer using a familiar setting that audiences can connect to. Instead, it uses a grimy, decaying environment that beautifully reflects the overall tone of the film. While some slashers still rely on suspense and tension, Terrifier leans fully into graphic, brutal violence. The kills are extremely explicit, with little left to the imagination, which you have to give credit to considering the effects in this film were about 90% practical. Damien Leone pushes the level of gore, making the violence not just a byproduct of the story, but it's now the focal point. Unlike Halloween, the build-up to the kill is now inconsequential. Instead, the kills are the focus and the heart of the film. The horror in the kills is now no longer in the lingering dread or the unpleasant feeling of a stalker lingering in the shadows waiting to strike, but is now physical and immediate as a response to the shock and often revulsion that audiences feel watching the kills unfold. Terrifier feels not only designed to scare audiences, but to push them past and way beyond their comfort zones. Having one of the biggest and most viscerally shocking kills at almost halfway through the runtime feels like a dare to audiences to keep watching. The film becomes a form of physical endurance for audiences to keep watching until the end. Like Halloween, Terrifier also taps into contemporary cultural fears surrounding random violence and the breakdown of social norms, making the film a reflection of a society increasingly numb to traditional horror, desensitized to violence, and seeking more extreme forms of entertainment simply to elicit a reaction. The explicit nature of the film reflects the modern trend towards more visceral horror, where the shock value lies in the sheer extremity of the violence. Leone escalates this level of violence to cater to a modern audience that, for the large part, craves more extreme horror. The film doesn't just want to scare you, it also wants to repulse and unsettle you in a way that feels tangible. This speaks to a broader cultural desire for more intense, graphic horror as a consequence of an overstimulated media landscape where shock value is now one of the few things that can still have an impact. Audiences are exposed to more and more visual content through TV, movies, and social media. We see and hear about crime and violence daily, seeing it not only on the news but on our social media platforms. We have information beamed into our brains for hours every day, information from around the world, and have become an overstimulated race consuming more information than our brains can realistically process. So in order to stand out amongst all of the content we consume, horror films, slasher films, have had to raise the bar on violence, going for extremes to elicit shock in their audience and to create a lasting impression. In Terrifier, the scares come not from subtle tension, but from a brutal, chaotic, and grotesque display of violence, crafted to make the audience feel vulnerable and unsettled. The unpredictability of Art the Clown, the visceral brutality, and the relentless, nihilistic atmosphere combine to create a uniquely terrifying experience. This evolution in the Halloween season slasher has even seen and forced a marked shift in tone in the Halloween franchise itself. The most recent trilogy of Halloween, Halloween Kills, and Halloween Ends saw a lean into more heavily graphic, visceral violence. This shift reflects how the modern audience has come to expect increasingly extreme and explicit gore from a lot of their horror films. The Halloween franchise has been forced to adapt and evolve in order to stay relevant in an era of overt violence, and and when films like Terrifier are pushing the boundaries. It's funny to me that you can witness the evolution of the Halloween slasher within the Halloween franchise alone, acting as a bridge between the restrained psychological horror of the 70s to the shocking visceral horror of the 2020s. The evolution of the slasher villain over the decades reflects shifting cultural fears and anxieties and the changing face of what scares audiences. In the 70s, Michael Myers represents the fear of the unknown and the loss of suburban safety. In Halloween, he is the boogeyman, a faceless killer that invades the idyllic suburban world. His random killing spree reflects the cultural anxieties of the late 1970s, a time when fears about safety and serial killers were on the rise. Michael's blank, emotionless mask and unmotivated killings make him a terrifying symbol of evil lurking just beneath the surface of everyday life and the facade of safety. Art the Clown, on the other hand, represents a more nihilistic postmodern fear. He thrives in chaos, and his kills are not just acts of violence, but spectacles of cruelty that he takes great pleasure in. Art doesn't just kill, he toys with his victims and with the audience's expectations. His extreme brutality reflects a desensitized modern culture. Art the Clown embodies the fear that in a world saturated with violence, nothing is shocking anymore, unless it is grotesquely, horrifyingly explicit. Another change and contrast between the villains are the characterization of the two. Michael Myers has often been called the Shape, or the Bogeyman. He is a blank slate devoid of emotion and personality. He doesn't engage with his victims beyond the act of killing them, and his silence and anonymity strip him of a lot of human qualities. This allows Michael to be a blank slate that audiences and filmmakers can project their fears onto. He can symbolize whatever people need him to. In contrast to this, Art the Clown, while not complex, has a lot of personality. His exaggerated facial expressions and grotesque humor give him a more vivid and memorable presence. Art taunts his victims, playing with them like a cat with a mouse before killing them. The cruelty in his kills and the pleasure he gets from them makes Art more terrifying in a direct, unsettling manner. The psychological horror of Michael Myers has given way to the visceral, stomach-turning horror of Art the Clown. Of course, while some aspects of the villain have changed over time, there are some aspects of them that remain the same and remain timeless. Both Michael and Art are silent, neither speaks, which makes them unpredictable and removes a lot of humanity from them, turning them into more of a symbol or a personification of evil rather than a person committing evil acts. In Michael's case, his blank expression and featureless mask strip away any traces of personality, making him a faceless embodiment of terror. Similarly, Art the Clown's silent, exaggerated expressions are unsettling because they mock his victim's pain, making him feel monstrous. Both villains are notable for their relentless persistence. Michael Myers is an unstoppable force, walking methodically and with determination through every obstacle without any emotion. Art the Clown, though more playful and sadistic, shares this same relentless pursuit, never tiring and always returning to torment his victims. This idea of an unkillable, ever-present terror is a staple of the slasher genre, which both characters represent despite originating decades apart. And, of course, in the first film of their franchise, neither Michael Myers or Art has a fully explained or grounded backstory as to why they kill. In 1978's Halloween, Michael is introduced as a child who suddenly kills his sister, with no clear motive or reason, beyond him being evil. Art's origins and motives are just as mysterious. He merely appears and begins his hunt. Adding to the mysterious origins and motive is the added element of supernatural abilities. As with a lot of slasher villains, Michael and Art both appear to possess supernatural abilities, in that they can seemingly move and appear from nowhere, and, most importantly, they can both survive being fatally shot. In essence, both Michael and Art perfectly reflect the evolution of the slasher villain over the decades, one rooted in subtle psychological fear and the other in overt brutality, but each embodying the cultural fears of their eras. Let me know your thoughts down below on these two Halloween season heavy hitters. If you're new here and enjoyed this episode, then please do give it a like as it helps the channel, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on all my other content, especially considering spooky season is well and truly coming, the best time of the year. There's going to be a lot of exciting content here on What the Horror. And if you would like to join this list of names here and have access to extra content every week on top of everything that you get on this channel, then there is a link to my Patreon page in the description box below. But in the meantime, thank you as always for stopping by. I really do appreciate it. Take care of yourselves, and I will talk to you in the next episode. Bye.